Hi, this is Brent McKim, President of JCTA, and this video is to provide an overview of the state budget, House Bill 200. I want to begin with a little background. First of all, I want to distinguish between the budget bill, which is how the state spends its money, and the revenue bill, which is how the state collects its money. This is focused on the budget bill, which is how the state is spending its revenue. Let me also provide a little background. Chronologically, the state budget begins with a draft budget that's unveiled by the governor. That governor's budget then goes to the House of Representatives. The House makes its changes to the bill that the governor introduces and then sends that to the Senate. And the Senate then makes its changes and sends it back to the House. At that point, the House can either concur with all the changes that the budget to the budget that the Senate made, or, which is the most likely outcome, the two chambers will go into a conference committee to negotiate a new budget that is usually somewhere in between the two budgets. Going into Monday, April 2nd, which is the last day of the legislative session before the veto period, the Senate had amended the House budget, and it had a great many problems with it. Maybe one good way to understand that would be to look at what the talking points were that JCTA was sharing with its members as they engaged with their elected officials. We were calling for in our talking points to find new revenue in order to fully fund all public employee pension systems to make the full actuarially required contribution, or the full ARC payments. We were also calling on the budget to include sufficient revenue in order to restore as many of the cuts made by the governor in his initial budget as possible, and increase SEEK funding for schools. And we were also calling for fully funding all active and retired teachers' health insurance. On the other hand, we were asking the legislature to just say no to some things in the budget. Specifically, we were asking for the budget not to include funding for charter schools. We were asking for the budget not to include any tuition tax credit funds that would divert public education funding. And we were also asking the budget not to include language that was in both the House, Senate, and governor's version that would have moved TRS employees who actually work at the teacher retirement system into the personnel cabinet underneath the governor and subject to the governor. So those were our key talking points going in, and frankly, going into April 2nd, almost all of those were not satisfied. And as everyone knows, we had a huge turnout of maybe something in the neighborhood of 15,000 or more public educators and their allies on Monday. Put tremendous pressure on the elected officials, and we got a final budget bill that was not somewhere in between the House or the Senate version, but one that went far beyond either of them in terms of what it did for public education, and which for the most part satisfied all of the requirements that we had on our talking points. Some of them not 100%, but certainly for the most part. And so here are some of the key provisions that were in the final budget that was sent to the governor. First of all, the budget fully funds the actuarially required contribution for all of the public employee pension systems, including the teachers' retirement system. That was not the case for the Senate budget, which was the most recent version before the final version that went to the governor. TRS did not have a full ARC in that one, but it does now. The budget also fully funds the Kentucky Employee Health Plan coverage for active teachers for both years of the biennium. It also fully funds the Kentucky Employee Health Plan coverage for pre-65 retirees for both years of the biennium. And I'll pause for a moment here to mention that the second year of the biennium, the funding on for the Kentucky Employee Health Plan is a little bit idiosyncratic, and that's because there is a revenue bill that goes with the budget bill that is projected to generate about $250 million of new revenue, $240 million each year of the biennium. And the way the Kentucky Employee Health Plan is funded for pre-65 retirees in the second year is what's called a call on the budget. And what that means is, generally speaking, the legislature can only allocate the budget when it's in session. And so typically if there is additional revenue beyond what's in the budget, that's discretionary revenue that can be spent by the executive branch, by the governor, any way the governor chooses when the legislature is not in session. However, the legislature can put what's called a call in the budget, which says the first priority, if there's additional revenue, will be for the following. And that's what is the case for the second year funding. And there's a call on the new revenue that's generated in the revenue bill. I think the first $70 million of the anticipated $240 million of new revenue is earmarked and designated and required to go toward paying for the Kentucky Employee Health Plan for the second year for retirees. In the event that that does not happen, which is unlikely, given the projection is $240 million and this is only $70 million. But if you came up short somehow of the $70 million, then the budget authorizes the teachers' retirement system to use the medical insurance fund to complete the $70 million that's needed. But we do not anticipate that that provision will be utilized. So that's a little bit of a funky way to fund the second year, but there's every reason to expect that is a viable funding method, given the revenue bill. Additionally, the budget increases SEEK funding to its highest ever dollar level at $4,000 per student. And although that's the highest level in terms of the actual dollars, if you adjust for inflation, it is not as high as in 2008. So we still have not reached the 2008 level in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars. The budget restores the SEEK transportation cuts that were made by the governor in his budget proposal. For Jefferson County, the even 100% funding, according to the formula, is not full funding for transportation in Jefferson County, but this certainly restored the cuts that the governor had made. The budget provides no funding for charter schools whatsoever, and it does not provide a funding mechanism whereby the charter school could get funding from the local school district. So that was a big win in the final version of the budget. The budget does not include tuition tax credits that would divert funding away from public schools. The budget restores funding for the Family Resource Youth Service Centers, which we call Friskies, and it not only restores the cuts the governor made, but it actually increases pretty significantly the funding each year of the biennium for Friskies, which we, of course, know are extremely important for wraparound services for students. The budget removed the provision that KEA and JCTA strongly opposed that would have placed the employees who work at TRS under the governor's personnel cabinet. They are now, they will continue to be independent of the governor's office and work directly for TRS. And that is a major improvement in terms of that language. There are a number of other specific funding provisions in the budget that the governor had cut that were restored. These are sometimes referred to as the LARS funding streams. That stands for Learning and Results Services, LARS, and that includes $575,000 each year of the biennium for Advanced Kentucky, $1.2 million in each fiscal year for the Collaborative Center for Literacy Development, $1.85 million in each fiscal year for the Community Education Program, $100,000 each fiscal year for the Heiser Hearing and Language Academy, $100,000 each year of the fiscal year for the Lexington Hearing and Speech Center, $3.27 million each fiscal year for the Safe Schools program. That's not only a restoration, but that is a significant increase in the Safe Schools program, and that's a very important improvement on the budget there. That's a significant improvement. $250,000 each fiscal year for Teach for America. We probably could have picked a better place to allocate that, $250,000. And $1 million each year of the fiscal year for teacher recruitment and retention. Let me go on. Those are the key provisions in the budget. Let me go through some other provisions that are in the budget. It amends language to clarify that the salary supplement for the National Board Certified Teachers is for public school teachers and shall be pro rata reduced if the appropriation is insufficient to fully fund the supplement. That has been in the past few budgets. It's not new language, so that's essentially status quo language of what's been in the budget in the past. It adds language to allow local school districts to apply to the Commissioner of Education to transfer up to 25% of their available capital funds for operating expenses. Normally, capital funds, which are used for building and construction and that sort of thing, cannot be used for operating expenses. And for some cash-strapped districts, this 25% allowance may be very helpful in allowing them to weather the next 2 years budget-wise. It adds general fund support of a little over $10 million in fiscal year 19 to help 31 school districts offset the reduction in local revenues caused by the lowered assessment of the unmined coal revenue. So that helps especially some of the coal districts with that unmined minerals funding. It adds general fund support of $137,000 each of the fiscal years for the School Food Services Program to fully leverage federal funds, and restores language to identify a total of about $3.6 million in general fund support in each of the fiscal years. It adds $1 million in general fund support each year to pay for the cost of advanced placement and international baccalaureate testing for students who are eligible for free or reduced price meals. It restores language to provide local school districts additional flexibility regarding the use of their extended school services and safe schools funding. It restores language to give school districts flexibility regarding their allocations to school-based decision-making councils. It restores language to allow vocational education centers to participate in the educational technology program. It restores language to identify $7.5 million in each year of the biennium for the preschool partnership grant program. It removes $4 million in general fund support each year of the biennium for the at-risk dropout prevention program. We were sorry to see that as part of the budget. It adds language to identify a total of about $1.8 million in general fund support each year for the Governor's Scholars Program. So those of you that are fans of Governor's Scholars, that funding will be important to you. It restores language to identify $50,000 in general fund support each year of the biennium for family counseling and trauma remediation services. So that's a good thing for families. In general, most but not all cuts made by the governor were restored, but there were programs that were not restored, and that includes textbook funding, which I think has not been funded in any of the three most recent budgets, and in fact, most budgets over the past decade or more have generally included little or no funding for textbooks. PD was not restored. KTIP was not restored. The KTIP is somewhat of a mixed bag in the sense that we get feedback from some of our members that the KTIP program is actually more bureaucratic and burdensome than it is helpful. Others find it helpful, so we get certainly mixed feedback on how bad it is not to have KTIP funded. I guess it depends on the experience each person's had with their particular KTIP program. One thing to mention is with dealing with the textbooks and PD and so forth, the legislature prioritized trying to get funding into SEEK and raise the SEEK funding because the SEEK funding is the most flexible funding and can be used for textbooks or PD or what have you. It's very flexible in its use for both schools and school districts. So the sense was that trying to maximize the SEEK funding would give schools and districts the greater flexibility than allocating some of that money into textbooks or PD and not having the flexibility that comes with SEEK funding. So there was a certain flexibility argument that came into play with that. The budget includes the conference committee concurred with the governor's proposal to provide $4.8 million in general fund support each year to hire 94 additional youth workers. And the budget also amended language regarding a report on local school district administrative expenses that directs local school districts to reduce their administrative costs to the extent feasible in order to provide quality instruction and to require local school districts to report to the Legislative Research Commission and the Department of Education on exactly how much they are spending for administrative overhead in their districts. And that is a general overview of the key provisions that are in this budget bill. There are certainly, as I mentioned, a few items that remain underfunded or unfunded, but by and large, it was a huge improvement over what we had seen in the governor's budget or the House budget or the Senate budget. And we can all feel very good about having made a difference. Our engagement on April 2nd did make a huge difference and will continue to make a difference for our kids. Now we just need this budget to be passed. As I record this, we've just learned earlier today that the governor has issued a veto. So if we are to get these funds that were restored in the budget through and to our schools so that they can make a difference for kids, we are going to need the legislature to override the governor's veto in both chambers and get this additional hundreds of millions of dollars of funding to our schools where it can make a difference. So we hope you will engage and contact your state representative and your state senator and ask them to make the override of the governor's budget their top priority or at least one of their top priorities in these last 2 days of the legislative session. Thank you for all you do to engage and support both the students you serve, the public education system, and thank you for your support of JCTA and KEA.